Kitco Mining's special coverage of the Deutsche Goldmesse is brought to you by Dynacor.
Where is copper exploration? This is Paul Harris of Kitco Mining, the Deutsche Goldmesse conference in Frankfurt, Germany. Joining me to answer this question today is Alistair Waddell, President and CEO of Inflection Resources. Alistair, welcome to Kitco.
Good to see you, Paul.
The copper deficit that's coming has been well talked about broadly in the media. But when you look at things, that's not really trickling through into more funding coming through for copper exploration. Why is there a lack of exploration in the copper sector?
Yeah, I think ultimately it's, it requires a fair bit of time and big land positions for the most part. And I think a lot of the jurisdictions where the copper deposits are found, often it's challenging, places like Chile, to get big land positions and things like this. And it's also expensive to explore for these big porphyries that Inflection is looking for example. So it takes a fair amount of commitment in terms of time and capital to explore. And I think it's just a little bit harder in many respects than perhaps it would be, say, drilling or exploring for a gold project in, say, Nevada or something like this. So I think there's an element of just that. So it's drilling porphyries in particular it's not for the faint of heart.
Well, let's go into that a little bit more. We've known each other for a number of years, and when I first knew you, you were working in gold exploration. So what is the difference between, in some ways, exploring for gold and exploring for big porphyry? And porphyries are what the big majors want because they're the multi-generational, multi-decade assets.
Yeah, so it's really, you're right. I think that the big companies need to find big deposits to move the needle. They want the long life assets that are going to produce a lot of good cash flow for many, many years, consistent cash flow as well. So it's really a key part of this. It's a gold project you can advance and explore and potentially develop relatively quickly. But you're going to develop a porphyry copper. It's a much bigger endeavor. And for a junior company to explore for porphyries, to do it properly, I think it's kind of a challenge. The amount of drilling and engineering studies and whatnot's required to develop these things is not insignificant. So I think the bar, for a junior particularly to get involved in a gold exploration story is considerably lower in many ways, and in the long term. Whereas the big porphyries just require much more time and capital, and that's probably the biggest impediment, I think.
The thin project development pipeline presumably will help push copper prices higher, which obviously benefits the major copper producers. Is there an element perhaps that their lack of investment in exploration is intentional, but it will ultimately help push prices higher? Or is it perhaps that's just a byproduct consequence?
Yeah, I don't think it's intentional. I think it's just a lack of investment in doing their own greenfields generative exploration. I think over the last certainly 15, 20 years, you've really seen that drop off. I mean, there are a number of groups that have been very successful at it. So, some of the one that springs to mind is Anglogold in Colombia, for example, very successful at finding new things. But it just requires, time and, people as well. I mean, that's a restriction that the big companies have struggled with as well, often finding people to commit to in the long term to find these big discoveries. So, a combination of time and money and people, I think, and that long-term vision that the companies used to have, the major companies, I think is not quite there anymore.
Well, growth has certainly been off the table for the big guys for quite some period of time, but now with copper moving up towards $4.50 US a pound again, are the copper miners, are investors becoming more interested in the exploration part again?
I think so. I mean, certainly the number of calls and inbound inquiries have certainly increased over the last few months, but I think that the big one is the major mining companies themselves are pushing more into copper. Like, we've seen the Barrick and Newmont and a lot of the big traditional gold mining companies, Evolution Mining, they're now exploring for copper deposits. And I think that's been a real shift change. I think, until a few years ago, they'd say, that whatever project has to be mostly, gold dominated, it can have copper as a byproduct. But now we know people like, Bristow or Barrick, they're just looking for pure copper plays. And that's a fundamental change in the industry that we've seen over the last few months and couple of years, I guess, really. But yeah, that's probably the big one.
Well, some exciting news potentially in the space recently with BHP making a bid for Anglo American.
Yep.
Copper was front and center of that. That bid was initially knocked back. Who knows how that will go? But Glencore is reportedly be interested in Anglo American as well. As a junior copper explorer, this must be quite good in some ways, I imagine, because it brings more eyes, brings perhaps a level of excitement to the sector.
Yeah, I think so. As you say, putting eyes on the sector, and there aren't too many junior companies really focused on copper as well. I mean, I think the pool of companies is relatively small compared to, say, gold or maybe lithium or some of the things that are, people are focusing on these days. But in terms of copper, it's a relatively small pool of companies. So it all bodes well. If there is some consolidation in the business, and we'll watch with interest to see what plays out with Anglo. But I think in the long term, the fundamentals are fantastic for the juniors, especially the ones that've got associations with the major mining companies.
Okay, and obviously all that's predicated on finding something. So let's talk more about Inflection Resources. You're exploring for copper and gold in Australia. What makes Australia a great place to explore for copper?
Well, it is very much a mining jurisdiction, Australia. I don't need to convince anybody about that. But New South Wales, where we're exploring specifically, very much pro-mining, pro-investment, and done a fabulous amount of work to encourage groups like ours to come and invest. They collect a lot of pre-competitive data, like in the form of airborne geophysical surveys. They're always leading the way in terms of collecting new data and new technologies and things like this. So it really is a tremendous place to operate, and specifically where we're operating in the far northern New South Wales. There's relatively few people there as well, so it's a great place to explore. We're not tripping over people and communities and things like this. So it's despite being 4 hours drive from Sydney, it's a relatively low population part of Australia, and it is the home to Australia's primary copper belt, the Macquarie Arc, and this is host to some of Australia's biggest copper gold deposits. The big one in the belt is Newmont's Cadia deposit. This was formerly Newcrest's major mine in Australia. This is a fabulous true tier 1 scale deposit. The other two in the belt is Evolution Mining's North Parks. They recently acquired North Parks from China Moly, and Evolution's Cowal deposit as well. So there's some giant copper gold deposits in the belt of rocks we're exploring, and it's a fabulous place to operate. There's no seasonality there that we're dealing with as such, and as I say, not tripping over people and things, and exploring in people's backyards makes a big difference as well.
Well, in terms of tripping over other people, I'm interested as to why you're exploring for copper and gold in Australia, but the company's listed in Canada, where there's a couple of thousand other juniors. Yeah. Australia's obviously got a thriving junior sector as well, listed on the ASX. So why the Canada listing?
Yeah, it's a great question, one I get quite regularly, and it was really a function of where the early capital came from with Inflection back in early 2018 when the company was put together. So we did some marketing trips, fundraising trips in Australia, and as a private company. And to be very frank, we didn't have a lot of joy attracting capital at the stage to go and explore undercover with a private company in northern New South Wales. And I think the timing was a little bit off in terms of Australia. I think we're also a little bit of an unknown quantity at that time. And the fact we were private and didn't have a clear vision as to when and where we were going to list. But ultimately, we raised capital in North America through our networks, and our major shareholders are based in North America and Europe. So we ended up by default being in North America. Now, what we've said is, if we can make a discovery in New South Wales, well, the obvious move would be to do a dual ASX listing at that point. But it's not an insignificant bridge to Australia. It's probably about $500,000 of legal fees and whatnot to get a listing in Australia. And I think the justification to do that would be a discovery hole, perhaps in conjunction with some sort of catalyst, some sort of capital raise as well.
I think it's worth mentioning there in the context of your comments, Alistair, that your chair is Wendell Zerb. He's got a long history in the Canadian capital markets, a lot of connections there. So I guess that really sort of played into that.
There's an element to that. But, to be fair, the vast majority of the team are based in New South Wales. It's really just myself and Wendell and some of the corporate board members and things that are in Vancouver. But the entire technical team is based in Australia.
Now, Alistair, you mentioned post-mineral cover. That's something I hear increasingly, with increasing frequency in terms of exploration. What is it and why is that becoming more a part of a lot of exploration stories?
So our model was really to explore the northern extension of this Macquarie Arc belt that hosts those big mines I mentioned earlier, where it disappears under this blanket of post-mineral cover. This is a sequence of younger sedimentary rocks sitting on top of the much older prospective bedrock that hosts these major deposits. And that was the opportunity. Really hadn't been explored. So the northern 60% of the belt, which we can see through airborne magnetic surveys, is there. It just hadn't been explored, mostly due to there obviously being no outcrop on surface, masking the underlying geology, but it's also, it requires a fair amount of commitment to drill essentially blind targets through this blanket of cover. So, but it created the opportunity for Inflection. That ground was open back in 2018, and as first movers into the belt, we were able to secure the entire sort of northern 60% of that belt. And the other key point here is that the targets that we're testing, these are geophysical targets for the most part, generated through analyzing the magnetics and gravity, have never been drill tested before. And as you know, a lot of prospects that are being promoted around have been drilled many, many times by multiple different companies. So the exciting thing from my perspective was these were huge targets in a belt of rocks known to host big tier one deposits that had never been drill tested before. And we were doing this 2 or 3 hours up a paved highway from Cadia, one of Australia's biggest mines. So that was the exciting thing. We know the belt has significant endowment in terms of world-class deposits, but these large features had never been touched with a drill before, and that was really the big opportunity.
So you potentially got the district potential. You certainly seem to have the high risk, high reward aspect.
Yes.
That's very attractive in the exploration phase. Now you also have, Inflection also has a unique agreement with Anglogold Ashanti, one of the world's biggest gold companies. What is that agreement and how did that come about?
So it came about, I think it was a little bit what I've just touched on really. We were able to secure that entire belt through staking essentially, and we acquired 100%, over 7,000 square kilometers of ground. We'd identified a whole series of very large targets, and I think it was basically ready to go. Very simple, clean story, and appealed to Anglogold. Anglogold, like I mentioned earlier about the gold companies transitioning into looking for more copper deposits. I think the timing was good there, and that going undercover theme that you mentioned as well. I think that the timing back in 2018, lots of the majors started to talk about that as well. So it was really, I think, an element of timing. It was good for that, and the scale of the targets which we'd identified. But the deal we have with Anglogold is sort of a multi-stage agreement, and right now we're in phase one of that agreement, which is a 10 million Australian dollar exploration program where we're going to drill about 30,000 meters of drilling over the entire portfolio, essentially a scout drilling program, drilling through the post-mineral cover, doing 2 to 3 holes in each of these major targets, looking for evidence of a mineral system in the form of favorable alteration or geochemistry or mineralization. And at the end of phase one, Anglo retains the right then to earn, through different milestones, up to a 75% interest in up to 5 individual projects within that greater portfolio. And they're fairly significant earnings. So to get on each of the projects, to get to 51% interest, they have to spend 7 million Australian dollars, and then an additional 20 million to get to 65%. And then to get to 75%, they have to deliver a pre-feasibility study with a minimum 2 million ounce measured and indicated gold or copper gold resource to get to 75%. So it's a fairly, weighty agreement for, what was a 10 million market cap company at that time. But it's really an excellent partnership with Anglogold. So they've been tremendous partners to work with, and I think it works well for both ourselves in the form of having lots of capital to drill lots of reasonably high risk holes, And also from an Anglogold's perspective, they had a team that were able to execute on a clear plan. And they're allowing us to manage that program for a management fee as well.
I mean, it seems to be a very good program that satisfies everybody. You know, as a junior, as you say, you get a lot of funding, and for the major, they get a lot of chances of exploration success. Yep. Using companies that are much more efficient at doing exploration than the majors are. That being the case, and given that the project development pipeline is so thin, why don't we see more of the established copper players, or gold companies for that matter, entering into similar agreements with smaller juniors like Inflection?
It's a great question, but I think the junior needs to have a bit of a vision, and ultimately, as I mentioned, I think a district scale land position is key. If you've got a strategy whereby you've got multiple large drill targets, which you own 100% of, and you control the big land position, I think that's really what the majors are looking for. And it was obviously in a jurisdiction where Anglogold wants to own their assets in the long term. But I think a lot of the juniors perhaps fail to really secure big, meaningful land positions. I mean, you want to be able to see room for exploration upside. And I think, because I used to work for the major mining company, and ultimately a lot of the juniors fail on that aspect of it. They don't fully recognize they need a big land position. So that's a key thing. But really, I think there should be more of these types of deals. And I think, as long as the prize is huge, you've got, think big targets and in big belts, and come up with some big ideas. I think there'd be more deals to be done. But it's really a testament to Anglogold, though, that they stepped and took a risk with us, and it's worked out very well for both parties, I think.
Well, maybe this will precipitate some consolidation of juniors in specific districts, so they can take a proposal to a bigger company and say, fund us and we can give you a lot of exposure to a district.
I think so. I think that's a key part of it for sure. If you can consolidate a key district and simplify it as much as possible and make it easy, and not have things burdened with significant underlying royalties as well, that's another big one. I think that's often a deal killer from the major's perspective. If you're presented with an opportunity and there's large underlying royalties, then it's a no-starter. So I think if you can acquire targets on open ground where there are no royalties, that'll be a big help for attracting a major mining company.
Okay, so goals for 2024, Alistair. Where do you want Inflection to be by the end of the year?
Yeah, well, 2024 is all about drilling. We're aggressively drilling on our sort of phase 1 regional targets right now. So there's going to be about 10,000 meters of drilling to be done there. And we've also announced actually just yesterday a slight modification to our agreement, whereby Anglogold have requested to or elected to move ahead with one of the phase 2 programs. So this is our Duck Creek project. And what that allows is we can run phase 1 with the regional targets to run in parallel with a phase 2 project. And that phase 2 project will comprise of up to $7 million of drilling on that. So to cut a long story short, it's all about drilling in 2024. And our real goal here is to make a discovery with our partners, Anglogold. But it's going to be a lot of drilling into a lot of very interesting targets over the preceding few months here.
Well, I wish you the best of luck with that, Alistair. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks, Paul.
And I'm Paul Harris, and this is Kitco Mining.
Kitco Mining's special coverage of the Deutsche Goldmesse is brought to you by Dynacor.